Oh yeah. Your bumper is a magnet. I stick on like a magnet. A magnet.
Yeah, it's magnetic. Join Sarojini on Caribbean Connections, Thursdays at 1. Walk through the sands with poetry from our great leaders and academics. Jive with us to soca, reggae, chutney, and calypso. Get your current cricket results, meet special guests, and more. Every Thursday, 11:30 Eastern, 1 p.m. Newfoundland time.
That thing just sticking on, sticking on, sticking on, sticking on there.
Hello, and good afternoon. Welcome to Caribbean Connections and happy International Women's Day and Women's History Month. Thank you for joining us from near and far today as we bring to you another spectacular group of panelists to celebrate Women's Day. This is our 5th year of celebrations in collaboration with CHMR, and we want to thank all of you who have supported and encouraged us throughout the years, and most of all to those of you who tune in every week and especially every year for this very special broadcast celebrating International Women's Day. But before we go on, we want to say a special thank you and welcome for those of you listening far and wide here on the island of Newfoundland and Labrador, in Toronto, Regina, Saskatoon, Winnipeg, Calgary, Vancouver, and those along the Sunshine Coast in Maple Ridge and Roberts Creek, all in British Columbia, and crossing over to New York, Connecticut, Washington, D.C., and straight on over to Berlin, Germany, to Nigeria and Zimbabwe, and of course my Caribbean peeps. What's happening, y'all? Big up to you in Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, the Bahamas, Jamaica, Belize, and to all of you whom I haven't mentioned, thank you for listening. We're opening today's celebrations of International Women's Day 2023 with this ever so powerful track by the beautiful one and only Queen Africa. This is Lioness on the Rise.
Are you ready? 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 Are you ready?
When the roll is called out, I'll be standing taller to face the darkest and the hardest of times. We'll be taking care of all the children thereof, but if it's required, we'll be on the front line. You can call me by my name, I am ready to roll. Once the rules remain the same, how the story's been told. Call me anytime, never cop out. Lioness is on the rise, don't you ever have doubt. Never say never, willingness forever to fight and be strong. Once it's for better, I'll write every letter and moving right along. And I'll roll with the punches, accept changes, work with the formula, do what I have to do, and call me by my name, I am ready to roll. Once the rules remain the same, how the story's been told. Call me anytime, never clock out. Lioness is on the rise, don't you ever have doubt. When you are willing to serve, we have room to observe, to see if you can walk the walk you told. Let me give you my word, my voice must be heard. Bravery is a piece of my heart. Call me by my name, I am ready to be standing taller to face the darkest and the hardest of times. We'll be taking care of all the children thereof. But if it's required, we'll be on the front line. You can call me by my name. I am ready to roll. Once the rules remain the same, how the story's been told. Oh, never, anytime, lioness is on the run. Don't you ever, oh yeah, call me by my name. I am ready to roll. Once the rules remain the same, how the story's been told. Call me anytime, never cop out. A lioness is on the run. Ready to roll. Call me by my name. I am ready to roll. Once the rules remain the same, how the story's been told. Call me anytime. I'm ready when you're ready.
We have an amazing panel today. Women who have worked tirelessly and who have given so much of themselves towards the fight for gender equality and equity and women's rights. So without further delay, let me introduce our panelists to you. Kelly Hickey is a longtime feminist activist and organizer, a mom and a women's empowerment specialist who just moved back to Canada from the Netherlands. She runs Strong Women Co., a company to help women be their strongest, happiest, and healthiest selves. With over 50,000 organic followers on social media, Strong Women Co. puts off workshops and programs to educate and empower online and in person. Kelly also offers supportive and encouraging one-on-one programs for women looking to gain confidence and clarity on their path. Oh, and let's not forget the bi-weekly podcast, the Strong Women Power Half Hour, designed to help you on your path through womanhood. No matter if it's a corporate workshop on how to be a better communicator or an online workshop in self-love or strong women, Kelly is always working to help women grow, evolve, and be stronger so they can reach their goals and be the leaders of their lives, families, communities, and workplaces. The more women we have in decision-making bodies, the better for us all. Our next panelist is Fatima Mansaray. Fatima has lived in St. John's, Newfoundland for the past 23 years. She's a community health nurse, case manager for Portugal Cove, St. Philip's. Fatima is a council member with the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Reconciliation Program with Eastern Health. She's also the founder and president of the non-profit organization Women of Hope International, and she has sponsored 5 people to Canada. Fatima has won the Woman of Distinction Award in Community and Social Development in 2020. She is an anti-racism advocate and activist. Fatima is also an empowerment and motivational speaker. Then next up we have Nabila Qureshi. Nabila Qureshi is a social sciences and social justice enthusiast. Her primary interests in research and volunteering are in the fields of refugee studies and disenfranchised communities and their equitable empowerment. She resides in and is a journalist at the CBC in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. And coming up after Nabila will be Rhea Rollmann. Rhea Rollmann, she and her, is a journalist, writer, and radio podcast producer based in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. She has a background in labor organizing and queer and trans activism and is program director at CHMR FM. a community and radio station in St. John's, Newfoundland. She's the winner of 3 Atlantic Journalism Awards. Her first book, A Queer History of Newfoundland, is due out next year. And our 5th panelist for today will be Renata Lang. Hailing from Toronto and Mississauga, Ontario, Renata Lang is a mixed-race woman working as the Business Diversity Officer, St. John's, with the ANC, Association for New Canadians. She has called Conception-based South Newfoundland and Labrador her home for the last 15 years. Renata obtained a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and Certificate in Public Policy from Memorial University. Serving 2 terms on the Memorial University Students' Union Executive, she worked alongside university administration, government, and colleagues nationwide to advance student issues and human rights. A former rugby player and musical performer. Presently, in her spare time, she organizes with local grassroots groups and lends her voice to audio recording and broadcasting and hosting events. Dear sisters, welcome and thank you for being here as we celebrate our 5th year in collaboration with CHMR to honor women all around the world, not forgetting to highlight the challenges that we've all faced and the achievements and successes we've celebrated, and to see the progress we've made so far as women. And today we have this very important discussion as we #embrace equity. This is the campaign theme for 2023. The United Nations theme is Digital, Innovation and Technology for Gender Equality. Today, we will discuss equality versus equity. I know folks use these interchangeably, but today you will learn the difference from our 5 inspirational change makers and how crucial they are for a sustainable future. We know that equity isn't just a nice have, but a must have. When we embrace equity, we embrace diversity and we embrace inclusion. Kelly, Fatima, Nabila, Rhea, and Renata, welcome, welcome. And thank you for being here, my superstars. So Kelly, you are no stranger to Caribbean Connections, and this is your 5th year with us on the panel. Thank you, thank you. The last 2 years, sorry, go on, honey. What did you say?
I was just saying, so glad to be here. And I told you, Sarojini, anytime you ever do anything, just tell me a place and a time and I will show up.
Awesome. Thank you, my sister. The last 2 years, you joined us from the Netherlands. And now you're joining us once again, but this time from New Brunswick. What else would you like us to know about you? And what are your perspectives and thoughts on this year's campaign theme, Embrace Equity? As founder and CEO of Strong Women Co., you have done a lot of presentations. So please, Kelly, give us your insight and why you're so passionate about embracing equity.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Sarojini. So lovely to be here on this illustrious panel. I always love having these wonderful conversations that are necessary and that do move us forward. In a lot of our busy day-to-day lives, we might not be able to really stop and have these conversations, but I'm appreciative of you putting us together. So thank you for that, Sarojini. So yeah, the whole embracing equity thing, when we talked about this in our pre-show meeting, you know, I kind of chuckled at the buzzwords put together, but then afterwards, embracing equity, I started thinking about what would it mean? Like embrace, it means to like, you know, bring it in and to almost cherish it, almost protect it, almost internalize it, right? And embrace equity. And yeah, let's start off right away. So equality is about treating everyone the same. Equality is same to all, right? And equity refers to fairness and justice specifically, which acknowledges that we don't all start from the same place, and that we are in different places, different social locations, different privileges, advantages, and disadvantages. And we first need to acknowledge those and then make adjustments to those imbalances so that we could actually get to a place of equity, of a place of fairness and justice for all. And, I think equity is a natural part of our evolution in this discussion. We started talking about equality because that's a really nice idea. And then we realized, like, oh my goodness, like, no, equality. If equality means treating everyone the same, we will never reach equality with this old kind of idea of treating everyone the same. So for an equity piece, we have to acknowledge the power imbalances. We have to acknowledge who has been historically disadvantaged and who has been historically advantaged. And we need to tip the scale. We need to reinforce through resources and support and education those who have been historically disadvantaged due to gender, race, ethnicity, geography, religion, all of those things. And then look at those also who have been historically advantaged and who are privileged, and those at the top of the power scale in our current white supremacist, patriarchal, capitalist society. So those people who, are have a lot of money and are white, and if they're male, even more. We have to look at what we have, look at how society is built to perpetuate our power. I'm talking to this as a white woman, and then be like, okay, look at all I have. And how can I share this? How can I spread this? And maybe that means I be disadvantaged for a little bit, or what have you. And that can be a bit of a hard pill to swallow sometimes, particularly, in the whole class piece. If you don't feel so rich, if you're a white person and you don't feel so rich and you're still going check to check, it can be like, what do you mean I'm advantaged? And sometimes you can't even see it. And this is where the education piece comes in. And I always like to look at the feminist standpoint theory. And so in the feminist standpoint theory, the main crux of it, and my professors in my master's would hate me for simplifying it like this, but this is what this is the crux of it is from me, is if there's a ladder of power, right? With the people with the most power at the top being the traditionally advantaged and the traditionally disadvantaged on the bottom, it's the people on the bottom who have the most accurate idea of society and of reality and of what actually is going on in the world. And so those people are the people who we need designing our systems, having much more decision-making power and abilities in our decision-making bodies, everything from city hall to school boards to, our governments and our corporate. It's about acknowledging we do need different voices around the table. It's about acknowledging that, hey, not everything is perfect. And so this is kind of a perspective that's almost, I won't say it's uniquely Canadian, but it's beautifully Canadian. Because in Europe, where I just spent the last almost 3 years, like I never ever saw anyone or had a conversation with anyone. It wasn't in the consciousness of like, how do we get better? It was a very different kind of holding on to culture and being more traditional versus in Canada. I think there's this idea, there's an assumption, we know we're not perfect. And we want, and in Canadian citizenry, part of what we do and part of our responsibility is to critique the systems we're in, which is not the case of the whole world. So right away off the bat, like that's a beautiful place to be. And that's why so much of the world does look to Canada to be like, okay, you guys are having somewhat honest conversations about these things. What else can we do? And I certainly did see that in my living abroad. It was one of the biggest culture shocks I got is like, you guys don't critique your government, don't critique your systems. Like, I'm like, what? It's not the Canadian way. And I just wanted to put a little bit of personal flavor in there too, because I am in a heterosexual relationship. I'm married to a man, beautiful feminist man, who does honestly try really hard, but it's very hard to, because we literally have no models. How do you have a relationship of equity that is heterosexual in this patriarchy with so much of our subconscious being trained and supported and perpetuated by the patriarchy. And I mean, like, just this little tiny things that I don't even realize. And then I find myself resentful and I'm like, why don't you do this? You know, so it's for trying to be, it takes a lot of work to be more communicative and to do a lot of work on his behalf to acknowledge his power in the relationship. And I'm thinking particularly of a really great podcast by Glennon Doyle called We Can Do Hard Things. And she had this really great guest on last week, Bozeman St. John. Wonderful, amazing woman. The story, holy crap. She's been like CEO of like so many cool things from like Pepsi and onwards. And she wrote this book and it was very beautiful. And she specifically talked to, so she was a Black woman in a relationship with a white man. And she was talking specifically about how she noticed all of his needs were constantly being serviced. And everyone, the whole family was of service to him. And this was like this subconscious kind of thing, you know, of that, you know, that he kind of just leaned into the entitlement because that's been his life. And she grew frustrated and resentful and you know, like it's not something, equity isn't a passive thing. Equity is a full contact sport. Equity is an action. Equity is a promise. Equity is working to actively try to make things better. And so we can be in that fairness and justice perspective. So I did get my husband to listen to that podcast and like, it was mind opening for him. And he started to realize like, I had no idea you did so many things in service of me. And he's like, and then I started looking at it and I was like, yeah. So it's one of those things where like having these conversations and being honest and sometimes being angry and sometimes being like, this is why I feel resentful, which can be an extremely uncomfortable conversation sometimes. So maybe, hey, just listen to this podcast could be like a good, nice, easy thing. So yes, that's where just currently embracing equity. That's where I'm at in this current day and in general, particularly as a white woman. And all of the advantages I get, I'm in full of support of reparations in multifaceted ways so that we can get to a place of equality in the real sense of the word, meaning equity.
Wow, Kelly, thank you. Thank you so much for that. And we're going to be coming back, you know, once everybody has done their spiel. And we'll talk about some of these points. So sit tight, everybody. And next up, we've got Fatima. Fatima, thank you for joining the team. And you're also no stranger to CHMR and Caribbean Connections. You've had such an amazing journey from Sierra Leone to the UK, back to Africa, and now to Newfoundland, and working in healthcare for over 2 decades. Fatima, what else would you like us to know about you? And from your viewpoint on this year's campaign theme, #Embrace Equity, what can you tell us? Take it away, Fatima.
Well, thanks, guys, for having me on this amazing panel. Gosh, I feel like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm here. That's so sweet of you guys to have me. Amazing group of women. I've read your bios and I feel, oh my gosh, what am I doing here? I want to talk about how do we achieve gender equity. Kelly has said a lot of what I would have said. The term equity for me means fairness and justice, but really fairness. And I heard this quote that I really love, and it said that we as individuals, we don't see the world as it truly is. We see the world as we perceive it. That's why I think when we talk about equity, when we talk about equality, when we talk about racism and things like that, people have different perspectives. They're seeing it from their lived experience and not from the reality of what other people are seeing it. Equity, it means recognizing that we don't all start at the same place. And it's so important to acknowledge that, right? And that's where we make the adjustments. That's where we start with those imbalances. So to ensure the fairness, we really, really, really have to, and I'm kind of parroting what Kelly said, we have to put in strategies and measures to compensate women. And I'm talking, this is for Women's Day, so this is about women, right? But there's equity in so many other things too that that can be discussed. So we talk about the women's historical and social disadvantages that prevent women from otherwise operating on a level playing field. So I'm gonna just talk a little bit about pay equity. All right, I was on the Stats Canada website, and it says that women earn 10 to 30% less than men at the same job, right? So pay inequality persists everywhere, not only in Canada. And according to Stats Canada 2022, as of 2021, the gender pay gap for full-time and part-time employees, for white women, they make 89 cents on every dollar that a man makes. And for visible minorities, they make 74 cents of every dollar that a man makes. What a difference. So even though as women of, I'm a woman of color, but even within the women and the different ethnicities, there's still inequality. We still don't have equity in that. So we want to talk about strategies, right? So one would be, I am so huge on education, reading up on the latest information out there, because we really, really, really have to build an awareness to what's going on. So we really have to stay informed. We really have to stay updated. And then when we create the awareness of the pay gap, then we can do something about it. Another thing about women is when usually it's men in hiring positions in big corporations and all that, but when they are hiring females, they should be aware of the stereotypes when hiring women and do something about it. So again, education, know that, hey, because everyone has stereotypes, every ethnicity, everyone does, right? So we really got to be aware of that, be conscious of that. And when we're making decisions, we make sure we're not making it based on that. So for me, with equity, I think it's just so extremely important that we take tangible steps in creating change. Everyone talks the talk. Everyone knows what to say, what's politically correct, and they have the buzzwords and they are, yeah, we can do this, but it's so different from taking what you say and putting it into action. That's just huge, right? And people struggle with that. So I want to give an example of putting something into action, because we're living in a system that isn't fair, right? It was built not to be fair. It was built so that some people can be disadvantaged and others not. So a little example of what I'm saying. So just say I created a company, and in my company, I didn't want disabled people to be a part of it. All right. So when I created this company, I built the building with a whole bunch of stairs, no rails. I made the doorway small. I made everything for people who could walk, can go in. But if you needed wheelchair access or anything like that, it just wasn't possible for you to go in. So just say after many years, someone bought me out. Someone else bought me. So the new owners of the company, they want disabled people to be a part of their organization, right? And they're all for it, saying all the right words. And yes, we want you to do this. This is what we want. So they can say all that. But if they don't take tangible steps and break down, like they have stairs, if they don't actually put in wheelchair access, no matter what you say, no matter how you say it, if you don't take tangible steps to break down what was there, the steps were there, and put in like elevators, pulling so that people in wheelchairs can access, it won't happen. And that's what I find a lot of. A lot of people know the buzzwords, but it's different from actually doing tangible things to create it. And it's a hard process. I'm not saying it's going to be easy. It is really, really hard. It is really, really hard. I'll be the first to say that. But you have to start somewhere. We're not saying do everything at once, but baby steps. All right. And I think if we can start thinking like that, if we can start thinking that, okay, this is what needs to be done. We're going to do baby steps, but what do we do? What can we do to make this better? And when we say we're going to do it, I know that for women, the government has the Office of Women and Gender Equality. You know, I think the government should step in. I think they should have policies put in place. And I know they do, but they should have followed through, like give incentives. I know now the government doesn't have money, I hear, with the healthcare anyway. So, but put in incentives like, okay, this organization, if you do this, here's this incentive. You know, if you do that, there's this incentive. So you're encouraging people to do the right thing, which because it benefits them as well as you are creating an environment that's good for all.
So, Fatima, that was very, very impactful. Thank you so much for that. And we'll come back and discuss some points, and everyone will get a chance. So, hang tight, everyone. And Nabila, you're up next. Nabila, even though this is your first year with us on the IWD team with CHMR, you are no stranger to CHMR. You've actually collaborated with CHMR on various programs. What other fun fact would you like us to know about yourself? And with regards to this year's campaign theme, Embrace Equity, you have mentioned that you will have 2 topics to contribute today. The first, the relationship between cognitive bias and critical thinking and its impact on our understanding of gender equality. The second, the rehumanization of the dehumanized through the exchange of audible storytelling. Go for it, Nabila.
Well, thank you so much for bringing me onto this panel, Sarojini. One thing that I really appreciated was it got me motivated to read and reread a lot of things on the topic itself. And as I began my search, I realized that it's all a search within a search within a search. And it took me down a rabbit hole. So from what I found out from my little escapade in this rabbit hole is maybe I'll begin with an image. There was this image that I came across. It's a woman, a young woman, and she's in the middle of the picture. And she has like the scribbly lines over her head, implying that she's probably feeling very confused, lost, or dejected. And there are lots of fingers pointing toward her. And it got me thinking that I'm curious to know whose fingers these are, and with what motivation, with what motive, with what intent are they pointing fingers to this individual. So if we kind of step back in that particular scenario, it takes me back to an image that I had seen, or a scene that I had seen in The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, when Dorothy and her friends, they enter the Emerald City. They're all asked, at least this was, I think in the book, I don't remember if this was in the film, but in the book, everyone who's entering the Emerald City is required to put on these green tinted glasses. And they're told that by wearing this, you can shield yourself from the brightness and all the prosperity that you'll see around you as you go to see Oz. And everyone puts it on, and suddenly everything is green, everything is emerald. And it's only later on that we realize that everything was quite normal. It was colored, it was colorful, it was varied, it was diverse. There was some pretty, there was some not so pretty elements to that kingdom. But the focus then was on the lens itself. What role did the lens play? So that got me thinking about ourselves as human beings. You know, when we come upon any particular topic, what biases do we have? And what impact do those biases have in our then analysis of that particular topic, which includes people and their lived stories and their experiences and their challenges and all of that? What role does that bias play in our understanding of the situation? Because we could be inviting all kinds of eminent profiles, even on international platforms, especially on international platforms where policies are made, which govern us, which influence us. But I think that the question then becomes on introspection, on being aware of what we, you know, what we perpetuate in the way we see something, in the way we speak. And to keep it short, I'm curious to know about the languages or the use of language that human beings use towards human beings. And if we tip the scales in the words that we use in our language, will that perpetuate any kind of discrimination and imbalance in achieving gender parity, gender equity, or will that lessen the bridge? So, for example, I had a look at this article that encouraged how to read history with the intent to minimize bias. And what I found was pretty interesting, and I think we could use it to perhaps understand this topic through this particular perspective. So, you know, some of the things that were written in that article was stay away from generalization, especially if you cannot account for or explain the variations in the stories. So it got me thinking that, you know, if there's so many people in this world, everyone lives in different regions, one person understanding of a topic, of a phenomenon, it may not necessarily be the same, and it doesn't need to be the same as someone, you know, one hemisphere away. So there are variations in our experiences. So if we cannot explain why these variations really exist, we know they do, but we perhaps cannot explain them on a metaphysical level, then perhaps we should stay away from the generalization, at least when we speak, you know, toward women or individuals who identify as women or want to experience the experiences of women. So this was one example that came for the language. Another being, you know, support statements by asking the question, according to who? So oftentimes in this digital age, we see so much information all around us. Study said this, research said this, survey said this, individual X said this, but according to who? Because that itself is part of that critical thinking, is that what powers are at play based on who's perpetuating this narrative. Another example could be keeping sensitive language. So a discussion around how to make language humble, how to make it inclusive, how to make it in such a way, or the way we speak collectively, how do we, you know, chisel away at it so that it becomes as least agitative as possible. And this one I found especially striking was about using parallels. So if you're, for example, this is just based on the article I've read. You know, you could have a statement where you mention that man and female turned out to be the directors of the Red Cross. This is the example, but it says that, is this biased or not? The suggestion they give, which I thought was quite at least worthy of introspection, was that find parallels in the wording we use. You know, man and female are not parallels. Man and woman could be parallels, at least if we want to keep it dualistic for now. But when you start, when we start examining language, perhaps a lot of the confusion could be sort of pointing down towards how we express ourselves and the words that we use, the consequences that they have. So I would be curious to read more about an introspective approach on how using language or endorsing language in your day-to-day life, in your formal writing life, how that could be one of many sources of inequality and inequity down the line. So that was one of the topics that I thought was intriguing, was this cognitive bias and the way it influences how we understand a situation. And then based on that, what outcomes does that have when it comes to the topic of inequality and inequity? And the other one, just I'll say that very briefly, was on just the rehumanization of the dehumanized through the exchange of audible storytelling. This is based on a very remarkable article that I read in The Guardian from 2017. In this, the author has written that words bring us together and silence separates us. Silence can erode all the achievements that we as human beings have made up until that point in time. And the example that the author gave is that you have trees that can exist individually for the most part, but they may not be able to withstand harsh conditions like the wind. But under the soil, when they connect their roots together and they spread it out as a network, they become stronger and they actually minimize their chances of being blown away in the wind. So stories and conversations are like those roots. If there's one thing I've felt more so now where I've been thinking on this topic is I've gone into so many spaces where I get to hear people's stories and I love it and I'm actively listening. But does that individual or does that group want to hear mine as well? And oftentimes I feel like my story is dismissed, it's censored, it could be even inconvenient in that moment because there could be this presumption that my story could be one of misery and tragedy. Maybe it could, but even that's an emotion. So coming back to that article, the author is basically trying to say is that the more we place an emphasis on sharing our stories, and as we share our stories, being aware of who we are, if we do this more and more, so we'll start realizing that up until now, most of what we have as a body of knowledge is only a piece of the puzzle and not the entire itself. So that's just to get into a little bit of that, but that's my what's the word? Spiel?
Spiel.
Yeah.
Nabila, thank you. Thank you so much for that. And we're going to come back and bring up some of these points, and any of you will be free to talk a bit about them. So thank you for that, Nabila. Thank you very much. Up next, we've got Rhea. Rhea, as Program Director of CHMR, one of the many things you do, you've heard, mentored, shepherded, and collaborated with many programs on the air at CHMR. You've certainly heard the viewpoints of many individuals from all spheres. Today, I know your focus will be on the United Nations theme, IWD 2023 Digit All, Innovation and Technology for Gender Equality. Rhea, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Sarojini. That was very kind. Wow, and so many brilliant comments kind of preceding here. I was just taking notes and having my brain expanded in so many ways. I think first, I might make a few comments about that, the embrace equity theme, because when I first heard that theme, I kind of had two reactions to it. On the one hand, I felt this very critical reaction, because it is so broad. And I immediately thought, okay, well, embrace whose equity, and who is being excluded, by not being named, there. What does that mean? So I had this immediate visceral kind of critical reaction. But then the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, maybe, maybe that level of broadness is what's necessary in order to truly embrace equity. And I think some of the previous speakers really touched on that. Fatima in particular kind of mentioned how inequities are, there's so many variegated levels of inequity. So, we often we talk about the women's wage gap, for example, but there are many layers within that. There is there is a Black wage gap, there is a visible minority wage gap, and then there are also, there's the transgender wage gap. In the US, trans people are twice as likely to be unemployed as cis people in the US. So, there are many different layers to how these inequities manifest. And so it's really important to keep all of those in mind. And I think the lesson, I guess, to glean from that is that if, for example, we're trying to tackle women's wage gap or women's inequity, it is impossible to do that unless we are also being conscious of all these other layers, all these other types of inequity that exist. And only by addressing them will we ultimately enable women's wage gap to, hopefully disappear entirely. So, so it's kind of this interesting thing where it's easy to ignore elements of inequity when we have these broad overarching themes, but it's also maybe a reminder too that we need to not be singling any specific one out, but keeping our minds open to who all is being affected by this, who we might not be thinking of. So that's one thought. The other thing, I also I'm so glad that Fatima brought up that issue of how do we make that tangibly happen, because I find that's often what's really missing from these conversations. The practical kind of experience that I would, I guess, share in that regard. I've sat on a number of what are called employment equity committees, and it's been very interesting trying to see how employment equity is actually how employers try to make it happen in practice. So we all see these job ads that say, they list out the qualifications, and then there's always that little paragraph at the bottom. We welcome applications from women, people with disabilities, visible minorities, et cetera, et cetera. It's this whole long paragraph of marginalized identities. And the question that's always been in my mind is, okay, well, it's great that you encourage that. So what? How are you actually going to ensure that those are the people who get hired? Because it really doesn't seem that the workplaces are changing, And when I sat on these committees, so I saw how that fight manifests, and I'm sure it happens in many different ways in different places. But for example, one of the ways that there was a big debate on one employment equity committee I was on, and this is what they were grappling with. They were like, you put this paragraph on all your applications, but you're still not hiring any of those groups. So we wanted to put in a requirement that if the employer does not hire someone from that group, they have to provide a report explaining why not, and actually pointing to the reasons why they did not hire the applicants who fell in those categories. And so we were making it a big headache for the employer not to do that. And they were coming back saying, well, we have limited resources, that would be so much work. But that's the point, like if you're not doing that work, you're not going to be achieving equity. And then there were other, mechanisms, fining employers if they don't manage to, increase the numbers of equity-seeking groups, who are applying. So those kinds of teeth are really important, I think. So that's one important thing I think that needs to be part of any discussion about equity. The theme of digital, I guess, inequity, equity. Do you want me to get into that now or save that for later? Okay, I see you not. Okay. I guess just broadly, I would, I think and non-binary people really, I think everyone experiences in some way, but I guess I first really became cognizant of this, after coming out and going through the process of trying, for example, to change my digital identities and exert some control over how that, how I exist digitally. Technology plays such a big role, I think, in how people experience and engage with the world these days, especially because everything is digital. And it's important to remember that, technology reflects the biases of the people who develop the technologies. And if that is white cis men, then that's what's going to be embedded in those technologies. Some examples of that, as recently as, and I draw a lot of the stuff I get. There's a fantastic book I read a couple of years ago. It's by Safia Umoji Noble, and she wrote this brilliant book called Algorithms of Oppression. She's a prof in the US, and she researches this kind of algorithmic inequities. And, she pointed out in 2016, only 2% of Google's workforce was African American. Only 3% were Latin workers. They were all white, and that's why a lot of so she was focusing on search engines and the algorithms that drive them, and that's how racism got embedded in a lot of these. So, for example, they were taking, when you do a search on Google, the programmers were basing their norm of human behavior on what white middle class people were doing. And whenever they encountered behavior online that deviated from those white middle class norms that were their own, then they immediately wrote them off as being trolls or bots or, people trying to cheat the system, not actual people. And so those types of behaviors tended to be ignored when it came to how algorithms were producing results on search behaviors. And some of the tangible ways of that, for example, the surveys have shown, and her work focuses especially on racism, but I think you can apply this to other identity groups as well. Like African American business owners were less likely to check in on social medias in their places of work because of concerns over police monitoring, because there's so much evidence of police discriminating against and targeting Black business owners and employees. The fact they weren't checking in and allowing constant public surveillance of their businesses meant that they were being excluded from a lot of the search engines and the way that they were registering results. So those are just some examples. What I encountered, I became really cognizant once I tried to change, my digital data, became really cognizant of how difficult that was to do, to change your name, to change, your gender marker on these things. And a lot of it's because there is this idea rooted in a lot of technology that your identity is fixed and it doesn't change, that you have this core identity and it never changes. That's a very basic idea to a lot of technology. And that if you have multiple identities, or if you're trying to change your identity, you're doing something bad, that's a sign of trying to do something nefarious and needs to be watched out for. What we need to shift, today, what we need to embed in technologies is a recognition that no, identities are fluid and people do change identities very often during the course of their lives. So, for example, we can do that by making it easier for people to change their names on legal documents or legal digital presences, on credit cards, banking accounts, especially the forward-facing parts of these. So when you go in to buy something at a store and you swipe your credit card, if the clerk is seeing data like your name or your gender, a lot of them are told to address people by their names. Well, if that's not if that might be the legal name on your card, but if it's not the name you're going by, then that customer is going to get a very traumatizing experience out of that. It's an assumption on the part of the clerk that the identity they're being shown is the identity the person goes by. So those are things that could be changed very easily in terms of the technology. Points cards, I know a lot of trans non-binary people who don't use point cards because, again, use of any kind of ID or card that requires some kind of legal verification of who you are can become a very dangerous and traumatizing experience when you don't have control over changing that data. So yeah, so those are some examples. I guess one tangible example of how that kind of problem can be tackled, and I guess I'll close with that, is I in the healthcare system here in St. John's, when I go to get blood work, the normal process that I would experience, you go in to give your blood work, you hand over your MCP card, then you sit down and wait, and sometime thereafter, when it's your turn, a nurse will come out, call out your name, call out the name that's on the MCP card they were given. And again, that can be a very brutalizing experience when that is not someone's actual name or whatnot. One of the blood collection blood work sites here in the city recently revamped their waiting area, and they changed it such, and I didn't experience this myself, but I was told about it. They changed it such that when you go in, it's all digitized, so you're not dealing with an actual clerk. You type in your MCP number. You also type in your whatever you want to go by, and then you wait, and there's a big screen, and when your turn is up, you're given a ticket with a number on it, and either the number of the ticket comes up or whatever it is that you typed in. So whatever is appearing there in the public facing interface is what you put in, or nothing at all if you opt to just go with the number. That was a very easy, simple way of changing the digital technology, to achieve some degree of equity for users who don't have, who were being brutalized by this experience of being misnamed or misgendered or whatnot. So it shows how you can tackle these things if you take the time to think about it.
That was very interesting, Rhea. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. We will take a quick break, and we will be right back with our engaging discussion on this International Women's Day Spectacular in collaboration with CHMR. Don't go away. Stay with us. Thank you for staying with us. We're back to continue our special of this International Women's Day broadcast in collaboration with CHMR. Renata, you are up next. So, Renata, you are also no stranger to CHMR and the Caribbean Connections. Like Kelly, you've been on the team for the last 5 years also, and have given so much of your time to advocacy and activism. Now, you can also tell us some other delicious little fact about yourself that you would like us to know. And as a diversity officer for the past few years, and having made presentations to various companies, schools, financial institutions, and the police force, to name a few, what can you tell us about your view on this year's IWD campaign, Embrace Equity, and maybe especially from with regards to the millennials' point of view? Go ahead, Renata, take it away.
So many amazing perspectives to bring to the table, and that's the beauty of having real, meaningful diversity in important conversations like this. I've decided to focus my time today talking about women's sexuality. I found myself personally passionate about that and engaging in gathering knowledge, more so on that, particularly in my life in the last few years. And I've decided to use my space to discuss this because I find it's typically a taboo subject matter in general for us, and that is a pretty horizontal consistency, across many societies. There are varying levels of, I think, perhaps freedom to discuss these things and acceptance of discussing these things, which vary depending on culture and oftentimes the acceptance or relationships we have with people. But while these things can vary, one thing that I find is consistent is particularly the discouragement and the oppression, I would even argue, of women when it comes to their sexuality. And I think about looking at this today perhaps twofold. And I see that as their sexuality in regards to orientation and attraction, and how heteronormativity is this default that has been programmed into us throughout our lives and from an early age. And so I feel like that's one element that perhaps we can discuss and we can unpack today. And another element that I have perhaps more information on and have spent more time reading about would be, I guess, in regards to women's pleasure and desire when it comes to their sexuality. And a few points that come to mind for me today would be the concepts of female hysteria, but also the writings and the philosophies in the works in Kama Sutra, the concept of the orgasm gap, and unpacking what that is and what that means. And so I guess just to start us off with female hysteria, some of us might be aware, I think, have all of us heard of this concept before? The female hysteria piece? Yeah. And so it's so funny, when I first became familiar with this concept, I had interpreted it as a pathologization of women having perhaps simply just verbalizing their own individual autonomy, their own ideas, their own desires, their own wants. And then as I did further, reading and understanding of this, female hysteria particularly was a term used to describe when women had sexual needs, when women had sexual desires. And so I'm looking at it from the context, let's say, particularly of 19th century, Western societies, right? I'm looking at it from that place and time. And so, in the reading that I was doing, it was revealing that the social contracts at the time, of course, where women had particular roles in society, which included being a good wife. And so the dynamics of sexual intimacy were ones that typically when the male spouse desired that they would, of course, that their partner would be their outlet for such. And then when it got to the point where it was observed that women were having, let's say, particular needs or desires that weren't being met, it was perplexing. It was perplexing to medical professionals, because the idea that women had their own individual desires and needs that weren't duties that were assigned to them to fulfill and to caretake the needs of other people was not a conscious value in 19th century Western societies. And I was even reading that their husbands, quote, were not taught to consider their own individual desires and needs of their wives. And this gets even more interesting for me, because in order to cure female hysteria, women were sent to their doctors, and their doctors would often would satisfy this hysteria through physical stimulation with their hands. And so what ended up happening was female hysteria really were just that women were horny. Women had desires that needed to be met. And I found it particularly strange, shocking, and fascinating that in order for women to seek out I guess you could say, the antidote, right, for this, it was seen as something that a medical professional needed to do. So this was through, physical, manual stimulation of the hands. And fun fact, the invention of the first, I guess, motorized vibrator came from medical providers to these women eventually becoming fatigued from having to, and this is true, from having to physically fulfill this this need with women. And so they said, we need to come up with a device that can assist us with these tasks. And so I am still perplexed by that whole dynamic there. And and I think reflecting on that can get us to think about how, particularly, at least in Western society, how far we have had to come and how far we have come, that at least we can even get to a place where women are being able to not only verbalize this, even have space to reflect on their own individual needs, but discuss these things with one another. I still feel we have a lot of work to go. I think we all know that there is an incredible amount of awkwardness, shame, and stigma that women still do face, even in modern societies. And so we've often, what I really appreciate about having these great feminist conversations and things that I've learned from other feminists is that the idea of women's autonomy and rights is not a Western creation, right? The dynamics that we have in our societies have absolutely evolved over time and place. And so when we look at the ancient philosophical scripts of Kama Sutra, they have elements that, of course, we know, have normalized sexuality. Now, the misconception by many folks is that Kama Sutra is simply just about sexual positions or sexual acts, when in reality, it is actually a body of work that embraces and unpacks so many different approaches to so many different, sorry, folks, we've got our kitty cat here, that unpacks so many different elements. Bear with me. It's a Sanskrit text. So Kama Sutra is a Sanskrit text on sexuality, eroticism, and emotional fulfillment in life. And so, so it is so much more, of course, than the previous conceptions of what Kama Sutra is supposed to be all about. So it's not just this idea of a sex manual, but it's rather written as a guide to the art of living well, the nature of love, finding a life partner, maintaining one's love life, and other aspects pertaining to pleasure-oriented faculties of human life. And so it is a very, it's a very big body of work, and it's it's an incredibly meaningful and complex piece. And so what I particularly found interesting about my, of course, very brief research on Kama Sutra, there were some questions that were posed about these philosophies. And one of them was, okay, well, if it is normalizing the idea of pleasure, intimacy, and fulfillment as being core parts of one's human experience, is that a feminist body of work? Is it a feminist text? And now the truth of the matter, if we're looking, of course, in this in a holistic way, is the way that the body of work is angled is largely written in a way that I think prioritizes men more so, and perhaps the pursuits and the needs of men. However, it still exists in this body of work that it still has, apologies, this, so Vatsyayana's arguments, which is the writer of the Kama Sutra work, still has arguments that are in favor of the female orgasm, rejects other traditional texts of the time that recommended cruel punishment for women who engage in intimacy with multiple partners. And there were also surprisingly progressive ideas about gender, and even acknowledging other sexual orientations that women would have. And I wanted to spend a few moments talking about the Kama Sutra as a reminder for us that there are other cultural references and realities when it comes to the fight, of course, for female liberation, empowerment, rights, and autonomy that have existed even millennia ago. And now I'll touch briefly on the orgasm gap in of course, in my initial piece here. So the orgasm gap is a phenomenon in which men climax substantially more than women during heterosexual sex. And so I think we can all acknowledge that a lot of narratives, when it comes to tackling social differences, will oftentimes first tackle the majority, right? And so, yeah, during heterosexual sex. And so I wanted to do a bit of work and look into what are other realities of the orgasm gap, right? So the orgasm gap initially, or not necessarily initially, sorry, but the orgasm gap, let's say we're looking at heterosexual relationships. So there are different, of course, studies that are done with different, different groups of folks, but so just for it to give us a bit of an idea and a comparison, let's see if we're just comparing experiences of intimacy when it comes to achieving orgasm between heterosexual men and heterosexual women. That gap through many, many studies sits at about 30%, which is a pretty massive amount, right? So that in and of itself reveals to us that there is an inequality here. But we can look at other orientations as well. So when we look at the rate of orgasm among gay men, we're looking at 89%. A rate of orgasm among lesbian women, 86%. The rate of orgasm among bisexual men, 88%, and rate of orgasm among bisexual women is 66. The lowest of all of those orientations is the rate of orgasm among heterosexual women. And the reason why I thought that this was particularly interesting to talk about is our patriarchal society has constantly been focusing on men's pleasure and sexual desires, but fails to recognize those of women, especially non-binary and trans folks. Our society over-sexualizes women as well for capitalistic gain, which is fueled by the male gaze. However, if women make the decision to lean in to their individual sexual practices, their fluid sexuality, or even the way in which they want to express themselves or clothe themselves, those are typically discouraged and seen as being negative, right? As being less of an intelligent or sophisticated woman. It's no secret that the orgasm gap, the reason why I feel it's relevant for us to talk about is because research is revealing that we might even think to ourselves, the anatomy of a cis woman's body is different than a cis man's body. But research is showing us that the gap is more rooted in social differences than biological. I have some really great pieces here also as well on some of the findings in particular with trans women. So perhaps when I revisit this topic later in our chat, I can come back to that.
I think we can. Do you feel fine with what you have said so far? And we can revisit a few? Okay.
Yes. So I'll just conclude with this point here. So sorry, the orgasm gap is a direct correlation to the role the patriarchy plays, which denies women's ability to use their own erotic as a power.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Renata. That was some very interesting research there. Thank you for that. And of course, thank you to all of you. But, before we actually call it a day with our panel here, I just want each of you, if you do have something that really struck you during this panel, I guess what each of you were saying on the topics of embrace equity and digital, anybody can come forward and say something on any topic or any point or issue that struck you. So, Kelly, did you want to start, or talk about something.
Absolutely. Oh my God, so many great perspectives. Thank you so much. It's just like in my head, so many different things. Number one of the things that struck me, Rhea, when you were talking about the really super simple thing of getting some blood work done, was how the reality that equity equals dignity. And how much you can't really have dignity, if you don't have some kind of equity, or how teeny tiny efforts, and I mean, I say teeny tiny, they have huge effects, but like having a computer system where you can type things in can have an actual situation where you're creating and allowing for a person's dignity. Along with equity. So that was huge. Nabila, I loved you talked about the rehumanization through storytelling. I think that is one of the best ways that we can do this. I think that's one of the most encouraging part of modern society and the internet, is that we can talk to each other and through documentaries and all of these things that are so much more accessible for everyone to make. That we can see and hear our stories. And I'm hugely encouraged by that. And I think that is literally our future, is when we can see ourselves in each other, and telling and rehumanization through the storytelling is really, really cool. Someone mentioned, I think it might have been you, Nabila, when you were talking about female versus man and the language and those indicators. So the last big talk I did was in Amsterdam, and it was at a digital trust conference. So a conference for like the companies and the tech companies specifically, who work in security and digitization and stuff. And so they wanted me to come in to specifically talk about, and they had the subject, the title already for me, and it was how to increase female leadership in the industry. Or no, it wasn't even female instrument. It was how to increase females in the industry, right? And it was just like this ridiculous, this word female just hanging there, right? And I was like, female is a descriptor, right? Like and usually in this patriarchal society, female is spoken to like a descriptor, like female dog, female animal, or it is used in a way of othering or demeaning. So it doesn't necessarily even have a positive word. Like and my clients and women I was talking to, when anyone says female, like that is an indicator of like, okay, that person is an ass, or that person is unaware. So people are showing their true colors with this coded language that they don't even realize. So of course I opened up the presentation explaining whoever came up with this title is clueless. We prefer to be called women, if possible, not female. And then what was also, I explained how to get more women leaders and more women employees at these digital companies who are aching for employees, particularly some kind of diversity. And I also explained to them, like, there's a business case for diversity and equity in these things. We talked about employment equity, but, like there are so many life experiences that women have online and further diverse with trans women and other women who are marginalized that are just not going to be in the purview of these dudes making up all of these platforms and that are supposed to be about security and safety and these type of things. So having a more equity-based group is always going to make your product better. And then I also went and I gave them point by point, this is what you do for employment equity. And there are a lot of really good things being done. I mean, what you were talking about, Rhea, I have sat with search committees, still mostly white and male at the university you work with. And they were very frustrated that they had to prove or give an example of why they didn't hire a person out of an underrepresented group. But honestly, it was like a 1 or 2 line email. Like, it wasn't like a huge kind of like, it was like, okay, we hired this white man, which was always the case. We hired this white man because X. And that's all they had to say, and everyone's subjective. So yes, I understand. And whenever I see that paragraph you were mentioning about we hire equity, employment equity, I laugh because I'm like, obviously, like it's like you're saying this, like I was like, if you feel like you have to say it, I almost feel like it's strange. It hasn't been internalized into your indoctrination. But there's a lot of different things we can do, including for employment equity. Some of the companies that have done the best with gender equity have actually, for their the jobs they put out, instead of looking at resumes right away, they get people to fill out these surveys. And the surveys are on soft skills often, some hard skills, but soft skills. And they have found that has been because no one's looking at a name, right? And it's a survey of your different kinds of skills that you can actually, they have increased diversity in, like, this is like big companies like Unilever and different computer companies. They've increased their diversity from this one thing. And they've also saved time because they're not interviewing people that aren't suitable for the job. So there's a lot of things that we can do that's helpful in technology. Just lastly, talking about pleasure, I will say, love some people talk about pleasure. Let's talk about that more. The patriarchal kind of thing is in the patriarchal religions of the Abrahamic three, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. There's a lot of fear-based motivation of fear to not do it. But the ancient religion that we all came from, the goddess religion, where we loved and revered women, the motivation for us back then was more about pleasure specifically. So there's two main ways we can live. We can be motivated by fear, and that's why we go pay our bills, and that's why we go to work, or we can be motivated by pleasure. And I feel like that is the more feminist way to go, is actually, and more humane way to go, and more happier life with dignity, is to focus on what gives us pleasure in this world, as opposed to avoiding fear.
Oh, very good, Kelly. Thank you. Thank you again. I was interested when you mentioned about speaking at this event in Amsterdam. I'm curious, what was the makeup of the audience, the group there?
It was mostly white men.
Okay.
And some that were clearly interested in what I had to say, and because they wanted more diversity in their workplaces. But I will say, after I was talking with some people afterwards, and we're just sitting around having lunch, and there was a young man. And again, this is the kind of indication of Europe is different, everyone. we have this Europe on this pedestal, but it's so traditional in the old world. There was a man, he's about 23, 24, and we're sitting there, we're talking. I had just done my spiel. He was in there. And he says to me, he wants a feather in his cap. I don't mind working with women. And I'm like, oh, nice. And he explains he works in marketing. And so there's certain sects of industry that are still female dominated, and HR and marketing are still female dominated, but everything else in tech is still male. I was like, oh, how nice. And he's like, yeah, I don't mind working with them. I got all women in my workplace. I was like, oh, that's nice for you. And he says, except when they're on their periods. He said that to me. This was months ago, 2022. After what I had just said, surrounded by me and other women. And I was like, you're kidding. Do you think that's an okay thing to say? And he's like, what? I don't, they're all over the place when they're on their periods. And I had a young woman beside him defend him and say, yeah, no, it's true. I'm crazy when I'm on my period. And it was just I was like, oh my goodness, I have no idea why any of you think this is okay to say. And I have all this data that shows that women are actually in better moods when they're on their periods and more productive and all these different things. And, but it was and he was 23. So he was whatever is younger than millennial and a Belgian. And I was just like, oh my goodness, I don't even know where to begin. So this is the reality. We think the young people have this idea, but there's still these ingrained things that have created an inequity for women in this world that we still have to fight every day. Anyway, as you'd expect, I tore him a new bum hole and was just like, I can't believe. And he was fully shocked by my reaction. And I was really impressed with myself that I didn't just flip the table over and storm out.
Yeah. Wow. Very, very interesting, Kelly. Thank you. Great story. Fatima, in regards to pay equity, you mentioned a white woman earns 89 cents for every dollar a white man earns. And woman of color earns 74 cents for every dollar a white man earns. I also heard recently, I was looking at some YouTube videos of women giving talks on IWD from a few years back and this year. And in one of them, it says that March 14, 2023 is the date that women would have earned for what men earned last year up to December 2022. It will take the women up to March of this year to reach that point. So how do you guys feel about that? I mean, we still have a long ways to go about pay equity. That's like 3 months extra women have to work. Rhea, I'm going to ask you about that. What are your thoughts about that?
What are my thoughts about the wage gap?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think you look at, I think Newfoundland and Labrador, is a really visceral example, I guess, of, it requires, there has to be a will to, I mean, it just requires you putting the effort in, like there has been an ongoing effort for, gosh, since when, the 80s, isn't it, to bring in pay equity legislation here in Newfoundland and Labrador. And pay equity legislation, I mean, it doesn't solve all the problems, but it is a first kind of step, it tackles some of the problem and gets things going in the right direction. Yet it's been, 40 years that government has balked on really bringing forward effective pay equity legislation. And there was a big to-do last year. The government was supposedly going to finally do it, and then it turned out the proposed legislation had no teeth either. It was yet another example of not doing anything. I mean, all it really requires is the political will to do it.
Mm-hmm.
One can always say that there is no money, but that's, there is money. It's a matter of what you consider the priorities are for spending it. Budgets are about priorities. So whenever government says we don't have the money for equity, it simply means that we are not prioritizing equity. They spend millions on, going to conferences, hiring consultants, etc. All it simply says is that they're not prioritizing equity. So, we're going to have this problem until governments start prioritizing it and start putting, saying that this is not something we can ignore anymore. This is something that we're going to spend the money on. And it's, and again, I think, as we've heard, it won't solve everything overnight, but it is, if anything, a sign that we're committing to going in the right direction.
All right, thank you. And Fatima, from your many years in healthcare, do you think you're seeing changes to that, the pay equity gap?
From a nursing perspective, our pay is we work on steps, right? So depending on the level of depending on the years you work, you go to certain steps, and it's pretty much clear based. What I would say about equity in nursing is, what I have seen is that male nurses get hired more into management roles than females. That's an unspoken, that's something that happens, but it's not something that people really talk about. And I think, men and women, there will always be, that inequality. There will always be that. I just think that, and when I talk about equity, it's hard not to, I mean everything, right? I mean, when we talk, it's not only about, like I'm talking about pay equity, but even think about women in the workplace and sexual harassment. And when you read the research out there, right? So females get experience sexual harassment more than men do. So it's so many areas. It's so diverse, right? So what I think is, as someone just said about the government the government saying that they don't have money to do certain things, right? To pass certain legislation. And I think that's because it clearly isn't a priority for them. I wonder if the roles were reversed, right? And women were paid more where men weren't. I wonder how soon how quickly that would change, how quickly they would put legislation in place to make that how it should be. You know what I mean? So I think the government has to put a hand in it. The federal government, the provincial government. I think they need to take tangible steps to put things in place so that we can see change, because we can't just rely on. I know we talk about organizations and the way they hire. If just say for organizations who, if they were told, look at Memorial University, they have a board, and many years ago, I was told that on their board, they have specific seats for people of color that have to be a part of the board. And if they want to be accredited, they have to have those. So when you put incentives like that, well, if you want accreditation, this is what you have to do, it happens, right? So I think if the government can do things that are incentive to organizations to say, hey, this is your organization, who do you serve, right? And so if you serve this many amount of people, then at least you should have such a person in your employment. Do you know what I mean? As a representative of your organization. But the government, I think if the government put incentives in place, people will be more open, organizations will be more open to doing it. Versus if we're just waiting for the government, for organizations to do it, what is their incentive? They're going to do what's comfortable for them, right? Because it's a huge change. Having someone who's different from you work alongside you, you got to wrap your mind around that. And for most people, they see it as a negative and not as a positive. They don't see it as, hey, now I'm going to get a different perspective, because we all have different perspectives, but we can use that in a positive way. Do you know what I mean?
And I'd like to say, the more diverse the work group, the less passive aggressive stuff. This is all kinds of data on this. The less cliquey, the more productive. There's a huge amount of data, and the more diverse a workplace, just the better it is for everyone in general. But I will also say, government's always going to say they're not going to have enough money. It's a matter of priorities. Everything's always a matter of priorities. And honestly, a lot of the stuff we're talking about won't take that much money. And sometimes they could even do legislation where they put some kind of pay equity legislation into the private sector, which, by the way, would cost $0 for the government. So there's lots of different ways we can do to be creative. We just can't let them off hook. Like, the government is our voice, and they will always, every government in the whole entire world will always say they don't have enough money for X, Y, or Z. And it's, we have to kick up enough stink and organize and raise our voices to tell them, I don't care what you say, this is a priority for me. Thanks, let's do that.
And one thing about diversity in the workplace, I think that there's a lot of organizations who, I use the word ignorant, and I don't use it in a bad way. Ignorant just means that you don't know a certain thing. And every human being on earth is ignorant on one topic or another. We don't know everything, but people have turned that word into a curse word. It is not. So in organizations that have mostly, say, white people, Caucasians, right? They don't know people of color, right? So all they know is the stereotypes, and that breeds fear, because that's all they know. Well, how would you get to know us if you don't hire us? How would you get to know us if we're not working? Because when you start working alongside them, then you're like, oh my gosh, they're not aliens, they're human beings. Oh my gosh, you like that? So do I. And you find your similarities. Diversity, unfortunately, due to ignorance, is viewed as a really bad thing, but it isn't. It is amazing to have perspectives from different places, because it increases your knowledge. You get to see things from someone else's perspective. And that's why I said, we live in a world where we don't see the world as it truly is. We see the world from our perspective, from our lived experience. So having someone else show you a different perspective of the same thing, it enriches your life. It's not a bad thing. And I think the government should, education, build. I went to Toronto some years back, and there with my son, and there was this huge billboard of a lady, a Muslim lady, wearing a hijab and all that, right? And it says, I am a nurse. And what I liked about it is, even if like subliminal, so when you see posters like that, you say, oh my gosh, like these people, yeah, they're educated. These people are professionals. I've been a nurse and I have been told, I walked in a room and someone's asked me, oh, are you here to do house cleaning? You know what I mean? Because they see the color of your skin and they the stereotypes, right? The stereotypes. They see the color of your skin. Oh no, you can't be a nurse. Are you sure you're a nurse? Are you
Oh
sure
my.
you know what I mean? But and it's not only me. Like that's happened to doctors, people of color who are doctors. But it happens because education. We really, really, really have to shine a light on the stereotypes, right? And we can only do that if we are employed, if we work alongside each other. Then you realize that, oh my gosh, there's not much difference. Or even if there is, what a way to compromise. And it's a beautiful thing. It's not a negative thing. And we need to push that diversity is beautiful.
Thank you, Fatima. And I know we're going to have to wrap up soon, but I still want to hear from Renata and Nabila a little. But in response to what the point some of you raised, according to the UN research, it shows that bringing women and other marginalized groups into technology results in more creative solutions and has greater potential for innovations that meet women's needs and promote gender equality. The lack of inclusion comes with massive costs, and this I found really fascinating. As per the UN Women's Gender Snapshot, that's 2022 report, women's exclusion from the digital world has shaved 1 trillion from the gross domestic product of low and middle income countries. And in the last decade, a loss that will grow to 1.5 trillion by 2025 without action. I mean, these are some pretty scary figures, you know? And I know we talked a bit about that, but just to move over to Nabila and Renata, and, you know, a few minutes, you can give us your perspective and so on, and then we conclude things up. We're having a great time, and I know it's hard to believe over an hour and a half has passed, right? But Nabila, you mentioned something about, which Kelly brought up too, languages, and you talked about making language humble, an introspective approach to our day-to-day lives and what silence can erode. How do you feel that will be very impactful when it comes to embracing equity? And like I said, we can certainly speak for a few minutes, and then Renata, I'll come to you. Take it away, Nabila.
I can come back to that in just a minute because I was taking down some notes as I was listening to everyone else. I think the response to your question is somewhere in some of these points that I'll raise up.
Sure.
And, if time permits, I can try to be a little bit more explicit. So just to get back very quickly to Rhea, I thought your example of biased algorithms and the role that they play in the digital world, I thought that was phenomenal. And actually that makes me think about that cognitive bias concept. You know, biased algorithms are coming perhaps from a biased cognitive capacity. So I have an example of that, and I'll say it very quickly. So there was this is just based on a Twitter thread that I read yesterday. The Twitter profile's name is Daniel Monroe, and there are 6 slides. I'll very quickly go over them. A question was posed to ChatGPT. Name 10 philosophers. 10 philosophers' names were given, such as Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Hobbes, John Stuart Mill, etc. The list is populated with 10 names. The next question that is posed to ChatGPT is, why did you not list any women philosophers? And this is what ChatGPT responded with. I apologize for not including any female philosophers in my previous answer. It was not intentional, and I recognize that there are many important women philosophers throughout history. Here are some examples, and 10 names are populated. Simone de Beauvoir, Mary Wollstonecraft, Judith Butler, etc. On it goes. The next question then is, why did you list only Western philosophers? And on it goes and on it goes. And the next question after that is, why did your list of non-Western philosophers not include any women? And after this entire, mumbo jumbo of all of that, Daniel Monroe, as he poses the final question to ChatGPT after holding it accountable, trying to hold it accountable, says, okay, let's try again. Name 10 philosophers. And the same responses are generated from that first question. The 10 male men, that sort of descriptors were repopulated. So it got me thinking about cognitive bias equals perhaps somehow linked to biased algorithms, and on it goes, the perpetuation. You can already see that in this particular iteration, they were completely silenced until and unless the algorithm was held accountable temporarily. I thought it was also interesting that Rhea mentioned about in the workplace, it's good to have that encouragement that we encourage women, people of color, etc., to apply as well. But the question is, what happens behind the scenes? We won't know necessarily, right? Because institutions are, they are sanctioned to being between walls that are hidden from view, which of course can work in their favor. But Rhea then mentioned about having employers explain why they have perhaps disqualified one person over the other. So that got me thinking about the power of language, and by language I also mean communication, expression. I think expressing yourself can also be one way to really put the onus in a very therapeutic way on someone to say, fine, you have a limitation, so do I. Just explain why you think the way you do, why. And let's try to figure it out. Let's exchange dialogue. I can give a very quick example. I used to work as a simulated patient over at the health sciences for their medical school curriculum. So what they do is they ask people to come in. Cases are presented to us, very simple, communications-based mostly, and we're told to enact certain situations. Patient goes into a clinic and has to explain a situation. And the purpose is for the student, for the medical student, to learn how to take history, how to capture their history in a very effective, communicative way. So I remember in those classes, the students would be very objective for the most part. They would see the human being in terms of its flesh, blood, muscle, all of that. But the intent behind some of those classes is to get them to say, explain why. Tell me your feelings. So, that can completely revolutionize the way that we have been missing out on the words, which at this point are unmappable, but we can always try to fill up the ocean with water again. And just to start wrapping it up, the power of listening and storytelling. This is a quote from a Palestinian doctor, very well known, by the name of Izzeldin Abuleish. It's a very lengthy one, but I'll try to speed up. And it's about the power of storytelling and how when we do active listening, we realize how much we have in common simultaneously in how much we are different, and the impact that has in generating solutions or expressions that are related to inequitable realities around us. So the quote starts as this: the thing is, you cannot ask people to coexist by having one side bow their heads and rely on a solution that is only good for the other side. What you can do is stop blaming each other and engage in dialogue with one person at a time. Everyone knows that violence begets violence and breeds more hatred. We need to find our way together. I feel I cannot rely on the various spokespersons who claim they act on my behalf. Invariably, they have some agenda that doesn't work for me. Instead, I talk to my patients, to my neighbors and colleagues, Jews, Arabs, and I find out they feel as I do. We are more similar than we are different, and we're all fed up with the violence. And I thought this quote, end quote, I think this quote encompasses a lot of these themes that we've talked about, hearing each other out, and all the inequalities that exist based on who you are, the experiences you have, in just a few phrases. And just to get back to Fatima's quote, where she mentioned that we see the world based on our experiences and our perspectives. I'm paraphrasing you, Fatima. I know you probably didn't say it that way. But that's interesting because just a few days ago, I watched this film from 2014. It's called I Origins. And in this, I thought was a very remarkable quote, which I think can, equip us with a revitalized understanding of why we have this unique perspectives, why are we attempting to assimilate each other. But here's the quote: every living person on this planet has their own unique pair of eyes, each their own universe. So I think with that, I'll just conclude that dialogue, exchanging stories with each other, active listening, being mindful of the biases that we possess and how that may influence how we react to that data, that information that's given to us, which could lead to overgeneralization or to the erasure or dismissal of the person in front of us. This, I think, should kind of summarize some of those concepts.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nabila. That was fantastic. I really appreciate that. Renata, I know we're getting close to wrapping it up. And like I said, I can't believe we've been all talking for almost 2 hours. See, I told you it's not going to be enough. Not when you've got the 6 amazing women here. No, not enough, not enough. But Renata, your research on female hysteria was actually quite fascinating. And it's something we don't hear a lot of, actually. So, I mean, if you and or someone else want to jump in for, a few couple minutes or so and just talk about that. And you also mentioned about oppression of women's rights with regards to sexuality. Do you think this oppression in the bedroom can be transferred into the woman or women's lives when it comes to working in corporations, being a boss, being a CEO, where you have to delegate and be strong? Do you think these are very impactful in the future lives of women in other arenas outside of the bedroom?
I'll be very frank. If a person, no matter the gender, but particularly women, if we are struggling to have true pleasure and meaningful connection, then of course that is going to impact our wellness and our well-being, which obviously can transfer to other areas of our lives. So there's so many elements that can contribute to our holistic wellness. But I'm going to pivot a bit back and clue up some of my main takeaways from the conversation around pleasure, around sexuality with women. So gender essentialism advances the narrative that cis men have these, this uncontrollable, these insatiable libidos, and they're the only ones that have them. And I'm revisiting that point because I think that for too long has excused or justified sexual harassment and assault in many spaces and in many societies. And this allowance, of course, for men to have their sexual urges and needs and desires, it continues to, it continues, I think, to perpetuate the victimization of women and not putting the responsibility on the perpetrators. I also think the harmful ascription of the male sex drive to trans women, it has created this narrative for trans women that their sexuality or their sexual desires are unnatural. And also, there is a lack of research on the impacts of the new hormones that are being taken on their sexuality and their sex drive. So thus, trans women are taught to give up on their sexual desires. And this is an issue we should care about because it's an intersection of misogyny and transphobia. Further, and overall, women have not been encouraged to become familiar with their bodies, their desires, and their pleasures. Some of that is fear-based. Some of that is the culture not normalizing conversations around intimacy and sexuality, right? Now, part of this problem perpetuates the gatekeeping of birth control, right? There are some religious leaders and some cultures that are still to this day purporting that women's responsibility is to procreate. And while we should celebrate that very beautiful aspect of the human experience and human condition, the fact of the matter is the autonomy has to be in the hands of women. Further, birth control that is accessible and on the market en masse presently is still designed for who? People with uteruses. So even though people with penises, and often cis men, are the ones who can impregnate, hypothetically speaking, infinite amounts of pregnancies in the span of a year, we are the ones, and people with uteruses are the ones that hold the responsibility of preventing that contraception. Now, I feel so passionate to talk about sexuality, not just to advance the notion that women should have sexual freedom when it comes to their expression, their dress, and the partners that they engage in, and the liberation that they have with their relationship styles and the way they engage in intimacy. But it's the lack of knowledge and it's that fear that I feel hurts us all. Because no matter what your personal values and practices are around your sexual intimacy, even for those of us who have few sexual partners, who go through periods without intimacy, who might abstain from sexual intimacy until marriage, if all of us are not taught and encouraged to seek out information and learn about our needs, then how will we have fulfilling sexual experiences and fulfilling intimacy, whether that is solo, whether that is partnered, or whether that is shared with multiple people? And to conclude, when it comes to technology, thank goodness for women in tech, because I bet you with the advancement of personal pleasure toys, those were created by people with vulvas, for people with vulvas. I can guarantee. And further, I personally appreciate the digital age because the access to information that we have in the palm of our hands is unlike anything else. And that, for me, has enabled my knowledge on many diverse facets of sexuality. And that continuous, not only the access to it, but the continual repetition of that information, and even being able to connect with other people around the world who are seeking out similar information or have similar wants or desires, to being able to connect with community is a huge piece, I think, on what can empower us, right? No matter what we are fighting for. And the more, I feel like the more we are isolated, the harder it is for us to organize and for us to gain access to those resources and knowledge. And so the digital age has enabled us with, in some ways, power to find community, to organize, to exchange resources and knowledge, and to be able to utilize all that for our wellness and our well-being.
Thank you, Renata. That was quite passionate and powerful, and I thank you for your research as well. Thank you so much. Before we sign off, Rhea, you mentioned something that I did mean to ask you. You said trans people are 2 times likely to be unemployed. How can that be changed in the workforce? Like when you apply for a job, are these questions on the application? Like, why are we getting these statistics?
Well, I think, I mean, it comes from a variety of sources. It shows how interrelated things are. I mean, obviously, it's in part because of bigotry in the workforce. I I'm working on a queer history of Newfoundland, and I've spoken to folks who describe how they moved to Newfoundland in the 90s when there was less familiarity with trans people here, and they would have no problems getting jobs in British Columbia, in Nunavut, in other places, came here and simply could not get, they would get interviews, but once they showed up visibly, I guess, in a state of transition, then they wouldn't get hired. So there's bigotry in the workplace, but also, if people experience bigotry in university, in schools, that's going to increase the likelihood that they're not going to complete those levels, not attain those educational outcomes. There's a whole variety of issues, plus, financial challenges. When gender affirming healthcare is not covered, then people are grappling with that, the very basic necessity to survive, which can impact your ability to do things like doing a job, or the mental health impacts of those things, which affect people in the workplace. So I think there's a whole variety of problems. Things related that I would just want to kind of circle back on. I'm glad Renata brought up those last points around trans women and sexuality, I guess, because I think those are very real things. I mean, I remember when I was filling in forms for transition related surgery, it was literally dozens of pages of disclaimers, warning, you may not experience sexual pleasure, and there was such a big thing and concern, and that in part has fed, and it was purely liability culture. They didn't want people regretting their choices and then suing doctors. But it's all that kind of thing has fed in the US, for example, a lot of the misinformation behind some of the very transphobic bills. The idea that people, that youth should not be pursuing these things because it might prevent them from ever experiencing sexual pleasure. I mean, I never experienced real sexual pleasure until after transitioning, and I wrote an article about that for Chatelaine last year because there simply this wasn't being talked about. And so I think it's important to talk about that. And the final thing I would say that kind of wraps these things together is the importance of intersectionality in how we approach these struggles. And I think a lot of us have touched on that, but we haven't really had a direct discussion about it. But, I again, looking at the US, where we see such a stark fight about these things playing out, there have been this year alone in 2023 something over 340 anti-trans bills brought forward to state legislatures. You also have over 300, and these come from civil rights groups, over 300 anti-abortion bills coming forward to state legislatures. I mean, and it's so easy to get caught up in fighting your own individual struggles, whether that's against transphobia or against misogyny or whatnot. What we need to realize is all of these types of bills are an attack on people's autonomy and dignity, on people's right to control their bodies, and against that whole backdrop is the fact that Black Americans en masse are being deprived of voting rights, so they can't even have any say in these things. So what we need to do is realize how all these struggles are interrelated and have all of these groups come together to work to help each other achieve equity, achieve liberation, really, against a lot of these very repressive measures that are being brought forward by white cis men in the US, but also in Canada. We see that creeping into Canada now as well. So I'll kind of end there, I guess.
Thank you, Rhea. That was awesome. And my beautiful sisters, guess what? We have come to the end of another IWD Spectacular. So, on behalf of Caribbean Connections and CHMR, Kelly, Fatima, Nabila, Rhea, and Renata, big thank yous to all of you for giving me your time today on the weekend so we can record this and get this out to our wonderful program director, Rhea Rollmann, in time for International Women's Day, which is March 8th globally. But we, Caribbean Connections, is broadcast on Thursday, so it will be aired then. So I want all of you to give a mad, mega goodbye, like Sister Kelly would say, mad, mega love. So say a mad, mega goodbye to everyone, and happy International Women's Day and Women's History Month.
Mad mega loved everybody. Mwah.
Come on, guys, let's hear it.
Oh.
Thank you. Thank you all
Much
again.
love.
It was splendid, and I hope you all had a great time. And from the bottom of my heart, thank you. Thank you for this. It's been wonderful. Have
Thanks.
a great day, everyone, and see you
Good
soon.
National Women's Day, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.